Hello, my name is Dave Zapponi, and I'm the CEO of ECHO, otherwise known as the Educational Council of Homeowners. Thank you for participating in this Ask the Attorney event. Today, we will focus on the Davis-Stirling Act in its entirety. This is the first of 3 courses in a series produced by ECHO to educate HOA board members on the HOA legal framework. We hope you will consider attending all courses over the next several months. For today's course on the Davis-Stirling Act, we ask attendees to please mute their mics and turn off their camera. For privacy, we will not, let's see, make sure here. For privacy, we will not be recording the general sessions. ECHO is a statewide nonprofit association established to support HOA board members and engaged homeowners. Our mission is to foster a better quality of life in the community, in community associations through education, advocacy, and connections. For today's event, we have a few housekeeping items. These are now presented on the screen. In addition, slides were sent to registered attendees beforehand. Please take a moment to review our housekeeping items. We have many HOA board members in attendance today, which usually means a lot of questions. You will have a chance to ask your questions of the attorneys directly during our 3 25-minute breakout sessions. Please use the chat function to report technical issues and to communicate directly with other participants in the meeting. You will find the chat icon by hovering over the bar at the bottom of the page. I will respond in writing to some of the more common questions or statements in the chat during the presentation. Please keep your questions general in nature. Questions about specific situations are better asked, excuse me, are better asked one-on-one with your professional counsel. For this meeting, we have also added the ability to turn on automatic closed captioning to enable this functionality. Please click the live transcript function located at the bottom of the screen. And now for our disclaimer, which you will find on the screen. None of what is said during this seminar shall be construed as specific legal or expert advice from the speakers, sponsors, or ECHO. If you wish specific advice, we encourage you to contact your attorney or another suitable expert. Thank you. Today, we have several sponsors. Please join me in thanking our premier sponsors, Spina Insurance Agency and Silver Creek Association Management. Our program sponsors are CID Consortium, DeCamera Management, Inc., and Kevin Boland Insurance Agency. Our registration sponsor is Associa Northern California. And now we will have a few words from our premier sponsors, Silver Creek Association Management. Please run the video.
Hi, I'm Laura Baza with Silver Creek Association Management. Our core mission at Silver Creek and the touchstone of everything we do is to manage communities with its people in mind. That means we don't just aim to check off standard management boxes, but to listen and cater to the unique individual needs of each and every member of a community. We believe in enhancing the livelihood of communities through our unparalleled dedication to customer service, our ability to offer professional expertise in all areas of HOA management, and our tireless drive to ensure that the communities we take care of are heard, happy, safe, and thriving. We aim to consistently go above and beyond the confines of typical HOA management duties. It's because we genuinely care about how your community functions. We understand that managing a community can be a demanding responsibility, but our team of experts understands how to get things done with efficiency and finesse. Please let us know how we can help you and your community. I hope you have a great education workshop today.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. And from the Spina Insurance Agency, we'll ask Cameron to say a few words. Cameron?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Cameron Peterson, and I'm an agent here at the Spina Insurance Agency, which is a farmer's insurance agency. Our agency has helped hundreds of common interest developments design their perfect insurance program since 1980. 4. Our agency specializes in customizing an insurance program that fits the individual needs of each homeowners association and planned unit development that we work with. Developing a lasting relationship built on trust is our main priority. The founder of our agency, Monty Hollingsworth, was instrumental in bringing Echo to the Bay Area, and we proudly continue the long-lasting relationship we have cultivated with this amazing organization. We have 2 locations, one in Sonoma County and one in Marin County, to better serve our clients. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Cameron. We appreciate your words. Cameron has a breakout room today as well. If you have, there's sometimes some legal intersection between insurance and legal, so you might want to ask him a couple questions as well.
We on the page. Oh,
that's
it. But
whoops, there's somebody whose mic's on. Okay. We also will be giving away 2 $50 gift certificates or gift cards, courtesy of our gift card sponsors, George Peterson Insurance Agency and the Silver Creek Association Management. Please stay until the end of the webinar for a chance to win. Thank you to all of our sponsors. They make this event affordable to everyone. We are happy to have attorneys from 9 different law practices with us today. All our attorneys are featured on the slide deck. The attorney introduction sheets, which were sent, and the attorney introduction sheets which were sent out prior to today's meeting. You will be able to learn more about the attorneys and their firms by reading these full descriptions. Here are the attorneys that will be speaking today. From Adam Stirling, Megan Hall, Lance Stewart from Angus and Terry, Rehani Dalvi from Badaline and Jacobson, Jasmine Hale with Birding Weil, Spencer Edgett from Chapman and Intereri, Mark Gutthews from Community Legal Advisors, and Amy Tinetti, partner with Hughes Gill Cochran Tinetti, and with all the law offices of Tom Fear, and Tom is here today as well. Finally, from Shearer, Smith, and Kenny, Bill Shearer. Thanks to all of our attorney faculty today for helping to create and support this Ask the Attorney event. And we'll turn it over to Mark Gutthews. Mark will start us off today with a brief overview of the Davis-Stirling Act and a discussion of the HOA legal framework. Mark, please start.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. And on behalf of the Educational Council for Homeowners, I also want to thank you guys for being here. I am Mark Gutthews with Community Legal Advisors. I am the Secretary of the Board of Directors at ECHO, and it's a privilege to be here. I want you to know that about 280 years ago, there were minutes from a commune. I want you to kind of mentally close your eyes and imagine Plymouth Rock. Something like that. It was actually the 1750s, and the minutes discussed 3 main problems of living in a community. I'm just going to give you 10 seconds to kind of think about what that might be, and then we'll go through it. So shockingly, the problems in the 1750s of living in a common interest or a tight-knit communities were the barking of dogs, the parking and storage of carriages, and the noise of your neighbors after quiet hours in the evenings. So there you go. It was the sounds of the bar and the frivolity of your neighbors as the hours went on. All right. Obviously, our problems haven't changed. And the thing about ECHO, the item that drew me to ECHO, and I think what you should garner as you watch this further presentation today is the following theme. There is no us and them. There is no that board of directors and we the members. We the members are the board of directors. We the board of directors are the members. And the key to making this vehicle work, as opposed to defaulting it to our local government to administrate how we maintain, manage, repair, and replace our homes, is to work with one another, to become educated on the systems and the practices that have been arranged and set up for this machine to operate. So community associations first really came about. There were probably 500 to 600 of them into the 1960s across America. And in the 1960s, the Federal Fair Housing Association, I said fair housing, is the Federal Housing Association, the FHA, began the process of studying how we could density, how these communities could be built in a more compact nature to create low-cost, entry-level housing. And the idea was that if we could take the land detail out of the equation and put a lot of houses closely together, what would that legal framework look like, and how would we build the communities? They came out with a study. The study finished in about 1965. By 1967, it was codified in various sections of the Civil Code. It was spread out all over the Civil Code and the Corporations Code. And we went from that 500 to 600 to about 10,000 associations. So as you think about your own condominium community, I can pretty well bet that it was built, or condominium or planned unit development, I can pretty well guarantee that it was built in the early 60s to today, or the late 60s to today. There's really not a lot before that, because the government hadn't sat down with the title companies to construe or come up with the design of it. As we moved into the 70s and 80s, we realized that those laws needed to be brought from differing areas around the civil, the corporations, and to a certain amount the evidence code needed to be brought into one common place. And that was undertaken by Catherine Rosenberry, who was an attorney in San Diego, and she worked with various other think tanks and thought groups, and effectively crafted the Davis-Stirling Act, which then Governor Gray Davis and then Senator Larry Stirling attached their name to and carried through the legislature. So the Davis-Stirling Act was born and became law in the mid-80s. It was born in about 84. It was debated as a 2-year bill. It became law in about 86. And in that framework, as it's amended, we have our present body of law. The Davis-Stirling Act is not the only law that pertains to homeowners associations. As you well know, we start with this document called the Constitution, right? The federal Constitution, which guarantees certain rights, which does affect our associations, oddly enough, in form of satellite dish law, the OTARD rule. And it does affect our laws in certain access, ingress, and egress that were then relinquished to the state. State law is the Davis-Stirling Act. But also we have other sections within state laws that speak to it. And then our governing documents, the CC&Rs, the bylaws, the articles of incorporation for your very own association, those documents all speak. So the Davis-Stirling Act then is the most recent embodiment of California law as it speaks to community associations. And how does the Davis-Stirling Act work vis-a-vis your association? And I think this is a commonly misunderstood thing, and I just want to talk about it very quickly before we kick off to our next speaker. So the Davis-Stirling Act was written, recall, after in about 1985, after maybe 15,000 homeowners associations had been created. And the devil was, how do we make a set of laws that applies to homeowners associations, which are both already created and which will be created in the future? And so they embodied some concepts that I just want to introduce to your mind so that you're ready for it as we go forward. And the first concept is unless otherwise stated. So the first concept is unless otherwise stated. Unless otherwise stated in your associations, those existing associations, CC&Rs, this is the rule. The association maintains the common area the members maintain their separate interest. That's a real common provision, but that's using that unless your other CC&Rs, unless your CC&Rs already say something otherwise. And then there's this notwithstanding concept, which is a really simple or fancy attorney speak way of saying no matter what is stated in any other governing documents, this is the rule the state of California wants you to follow. And a good example of that is the Civil Code as it pertains to assessments. Unless or notwithstanding whatever's stated in your governing documents, the association may only raise assessments more than 10 or 20% without obtaining member approval, or may only special assess up to 5% without gaining member approval. After that, they need to gain member approval. So all that cost of living stuff that's in about 1% of your CC&Rs out there, all that goes out the window, because notwithstanding, we follow the CC&Rs, we follow the Davis-Stirling Act. So with that, I want to turn it over to the next speaker. I hope that gives you a good overview of where the Davis-Stirling Act fits and how we're going to try to orchestrate that system into our communities in the future. Thank you, David.
Okay.
Bill, it's up to you. Please go ahead and continue with the program.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Scherer of Scherer, Smith & Kenny in San Francisco. I'm delighted to be here this morning to kick off this overview of the Davis-Stirling Act. My particular assignment is Chapter 1, which deals with the general provisions of the Act, or in other words, the definitions. Chapter 1 tends to be a relatively lengthy chapter, and for that reason, I'm focusing only only on the most material definitions, or those that cause some confusion with my clients. We also look forward, along with my colleague, Luis Sarmiento, to seeing you in the breakout rooms this morning. Let's go to the next slide, please. So basically, the first thing we're going to talk about is delivery of notice and provision of notice by the members. So individual delivery of notice is actually a term within the Davis-Stirling Act. And stated broadly, it means particular communications that deal with the rights and obligations of the members or of a particular member, and things such as the annual disclosures that the association may provide. But there are specific notice requirements for individual notice. As you'll see in subsection A, it provides that individual notice shall be by first-class mail, postage prepaid, registered or certified mail, express mail, or overnight delivery. And it must be addressed to the recipient's address last shown on the books of the association. Email, facsimile, and other electronic means are also permitted, but only if the recipient has consented to delivery by such means. Further, subsection B provides that upon receipt of a request by the member identifying a secondary address, the association must provide notice not only to the primary, but also to the secondary address. If you can go to the next slide, please. As a note, the particular section is only in place until the end of the year. After January 1st, individual delivery or notice is going to require that the association deliver in accordance with the member's specified preferred delivery method. If we can go to the next slide, please. Member contact information. So Section 4041 basically provides a reciprocal obligation. In B, the association is required to solicit the annual the information from the members with regard to how to contact them. In A, it discusses what the members on an annual basis required to provide, which is the member's preferred delivery method for receiving notices, an alternate or secondary delivery method of receiving notices from the association, if they have a legal representative, his or her name, mailing address, and email address in situations where owners may not be maybe gone for a period of time, and also whether the separate interest is owner occupied, rented out, developed but vacant, or if the parcel is undeveloped land. So we can go to the next slide, please. Section 4045. There we go. Section 4045 deals with general delivery. And general delivery is essentially regular notices of regular meetings, of barbecues, other things that may be sent out of general interest to the membership. There are several ways of giving general delivery. And the first one is any method provided for delivery of individual notice, which is what we just went through. The remaining is inclusion of a billing within a billing statement or in a newsletter or other document, posting the printed document in a prominent location in the common area where everyone will see it. If there's broadcast television programming, including the general notice in the programming, or placing it in a prominent spot in the website. So I want to note that in B, it says notwithstanding A, if a member requests to receive general notice by individual delivery, all general notices to that member has to be sent by individual delivery. So it kind of falls back onto the original definition. We always recommend to our clients, if you're going to give any notice, you might as well give notice by individual notice, because that's the default, and it's frankly a much more effective way to do it, and you don't have to get into the debate as to whether it's a general delivery or an individual notice. We can go to the next slide, please. There is oftentimes confusion over what approval requirements are necessary in order to pass a matter that's before the association. The most common thresholds are either approval by a majority of the members or approval by a majority of the quorum. Some people get confused as to what those two thresholds mean. Approval by a majority is simple. It's approval by a majority of all the members. So if there's 100 members in the association, you need 51 of them to vote in favor in order to pass a particular matter that's in front of them. The approval by a majority of the quorum is a little different because it only requires that the approval by the members present at a meeting or casting a ballot where a quorum exists, the majority of those members will pass the matter. So for example, using this 100-member association, if you have a quorum requirement within your bylaws of 50, then 26 people, and you get the 50 people to attend, 26 people voting in favor will pass that particular matter. So next slide, please. I think the important thing dealing with board meetings is that it's a very broad definition. As you'll see in A, it says a congregation at the same time and place of a sufficient number of directors to establish a quorum of the board in which an item of business is discussed will be deemed to be a board meeting. So for example, oftentimes the boards get along with one another and they might have a party or go to dinner together. If three board members of a 5-member board end up going to dinner, then that would constitute a board meeting if they talk about an item of business of the association. And obviously, if you're having a board meeting, then you're subject to the Open Meeting Act and you're subject to other notice requirements so that the members are able to come and hear what you have to say. If you note, item of business means any action within the authority of the board, except those items that have been delegated to others. So in other words, the item of business is very broadly defined, and a board meeting is very broadly defined. So you just have to be careful to talk about families and things of more interest than the association if you happen to congregate with your fellow board members. Next slide, please. So the common area, it's a very important term, but it's a very simple definition. It's essentially anything that's not the separate interest within a CID. Usually if you look at the CC&Rs, the separate interest will be defined in a very detailed way. Common area is just like, yeah, and everything else is common area. So I have some diagrams in this slide and the next slide, which show for each type of common interest development, what would be deemed to be a separate interest within that particular type of common interest development, and what would be deemed to be common area. I won't go through those this morning, but I welcome you to take a look at it. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. So exclusive use common area is an important term as well. And from a drafting standpoint, you want the association to be responsible for the watertight integrity of a particular building. You want it to be responsible for the structure, yet a lot of amenities are sometimes outside of the separate interest. So, and also items of maintenance are sometimes outside the separate interest. So, so these areas of common area are assigned exclusively to a particular member, and the most common situation are parking places, storage areas, patios and balconies and things of that sort. So in those circumstances, typically the association will have the majority of the maintenance, but there may be certain other maintenance obligations which are placed upon the members who have enjoyment of those specific areas of common area. I know subsection B specifically is also a inclusive provision which says, unless the declaration otherwise provides, shutters, awnings, windows, boxes, doorsteps, patios, stoops, are exclusively serve a particular separate interest but are outside of the separate interest will be deemed to be exclusive use common area. And subsection C just basically states that for telecommunications purposes, if you have telephone wires or other things that are specifically serve your separate interest, that also will be deemed to be exclusive use common area. Okay, next slide, please. Governing documents and separate interests. For your purposes in understanding your governing documents, they mean the declaration and any other document that deals with the governing of the operation of the common interest development, okay, or association. So bylaws, policies, house rules, articles, fine policies, all of those fall into the bucket of what would be considered to be governing documents. And finally, the definition of separate interest. There are four essential types of common interest development, which are community apartment projects, condominium projects, land developments, and stock co-ops. And while the definitions vary depending on the type of common interest development, essentially it's where you live and the box of space that you occupy as your primary residence. But I welcome you to take a look at that. So with that, I think that's the last slide. So I appreciate this very brief time with you, and I look forward to seeing you in the breakout session.
Mark, you're next.
Well, I'd have to unmute to do that. Why don't we go another slide there, Connor? So this is a very brief snapshot of a question that doesn't arise very often, because usually if you are a common interest subdivision, you are. But if you get it wrong, it can be very expensive for the community. So some communities which believe they are Davis Stirling Act common interest subdivisions sometimes try to prosecute an action in court, or they sometimes prosecute a collections action and get hit by the Fair Debt Collections Act because they don't really fully comply with the requirements of being a common interest subdivision. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what it is to be. Now, I'm going to start by saying that if you're a condominium, there's generally no question as to whether you are a Davis Stirling common interest subdivision. The system was designed for it. And you'll see very quickly that you're going to fall within it. The question typically arises if you're a planned unit development. And if you're a planned unit development, then we need to look at definitions of what is your common area. So we'll get into it here as we go through. So Civil Code 4200, when do we know that the Davis-Stirling Act applies? We know the Davis-Stirling Act applies when you're a common interest subdivision. What makes that? Well, you have a separate interest. So speaking most easily, a condominium, right? Your unit, the one that you walk in and turn your key in, that's your separate interest. That is your condo unit. And that's combined with a portion or a share of a larger community. And so that is typically, let's say you have 33 units in your condominium association, you're going to get a 1/33rd interest in the common area, which is everything but the units. So the common area is everything but the units. And when you get conveyed your unit, you get conveyed parcel 1, which is unit 5, and then parcel 2, a 1/33rd interest in the common area, meaning that you co-own or share all of that common area. There's some other methods of doing it, but that's kind of the big picture. Okay, so what happens when you are using a lot? And when you have a planned unit development, you got a house on a piece of property in a neighborhood. Well, then the question is, as you see in number 2, in a condo, it's very easy that you got conveyed that interest in the common area. But what if you're a member of an association? Hey, Mark, we have an association, but we don't really have some cross easements or the right to assess. Then there's a question in the planned unit development whether you are really just kind of an architectural committee. That is, whether you're an enforcement arm of a set of CC&Rs, but you don't really have the full imprimatur of a corporation which is charged with the obligation to maintain, repair, and replace pursuant to the Davis-Stirling Act. Next slide. So it's just a question that if you're a condo, it's usually really no question. If you're a planned unit development, sometimes we want to make sure if you have common area, if you look in your CC&Rs and you see the definition and in the definition section of the CC&Rs, and you look and you go, oh, lot, and that's the one with separate interest with a house. Great, I know I'm a planned development, and then I go to common area and there's no definition. We might want to roll over to an attorney before we start suing people. If there is a definition of common area, then you are good and you do have a common interest subdivision. Next slide. So what kinds of common interest developments are there? Well, we have the most common in California are the condominiums. And in that situation, of course, you have your separate interest, which is the condominium. Then you have an undivided interest in the common area, that 1/33 share that I talked about. We have a recorded set of CC&Rs and a condo plan. Next slide. But there's, as I stated, there's situations where we do have sort of these enforcement arms of CC&Rs. Well, we'll have CC&Rs, but there's no real easement rights. There's no real cross maintenance obligation. The corporation is really just formed to sort of make sure that we don't park on each other's grass or on in the front lawn or in the areas. And those are the communities I grew up with in East LA, where we had CC&Rs, but we had no common interest subdivision created to enforce them. Next slide. So there is an exception, but I think it's more confusing than it's worth. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the questions is, does the Davis-Stirling Act apply to commercial or industrial associations? And so the answer to that is the act came in the mid-'80s, and it had some exemption language that basically said, unless we identify the sections that don't apply here, then everything applies. And so what happened is, over time, they forgot to identify the sections that didn't apply to commercial associations, and the responsibilities of commercial associations got to be the same in many ways as residential associations. So about 3 years ago, the commercial associations, led by a prominent commercial management company in the industry, they actually retained me, and we worked together to get commercial taken out of the Residential Act. And so when the Davis-Stirling Act was rewritten and became law, and I think that was right around circa 2014, we got commercial associations taken out of it. So they have their own act, which is separate because it's a common interest. There's a lot of shared concepts, but absolutely not. Commercial associations are not bound by the Davis-Stirling Act. Next slide. So there's differences in the two acts. So if you are here on behalf of a commercial association, you should know that you're really much more bylaw driven than commercial act driven. That is, there is no requirement of the 28 days notice of operating rules. If you're a commercial association and you have a problem with people storing vehicles overnight, camping out in your community overnight, storing trucks and that kind of thing on your property overnight, we can adopt rules literally overnight. We can implement substantial $1,500, $2,500 fines, and that will clean up your parking problem overnight. So in a commercial association, we don't have the 28-day notice requirement for operating rules. Likewise, there's no limitation, the 20%. Remember, I taught you early on, the notwithstanding what's in the governing documents, the association has to get approval, the residential association has to get approval to raise assessments more than 20% or special assess more than 5%. That limitation doesn't exist in commercial associations. And finally, there's no election rules or election law requirements in commercial associations. They actually vote very differently than residential associations. They vote based on square footage and not the number, or not the unit number. Okay, so we're going to follow the association's bylaws unless there's something in the Commercial Act that applies. And frankly, the Commercial Act is so not minor in its reach that a lot of times it really doesn't have anything to say about how to operate the corporation. Next slide. All right, Megan Hall, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Megan Hall. I'm from Adams Stirling, and I'm going to be talking to you about Chapter 3, which covers your governing documents. So Bill did a great job. He kind of gave me my introduction here, which is that Civil Code Section 4150, which is in that definition section he talked about. It defines what are your governing documents. So what's included are your CC&Rs, sometimes referred to as your declaration, your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your operating rules, your condominium plan and subdivision map. And as Bill mentioned, it also includes things that you might not think of as being included in your operating rules, like some of your policies. It includes basically anything that helps to govern your association. So now that we've defined what governing documents are, what do you do if your governing documents conflict? Hopefully they don't, but luckily Civil Code 4205 gives us the hierarchy of documents. So first of all, I put it in a pyramid, and I've probably done this a little bit counterintuitively, where I've started at the highest authority at the top and you move down as you move down the pyramid. So essentially, as Mark mentioned earlier, if the law is typically going to prevail, and it gives you some indications within the law itself. So sometimes it will say notwithstanding what's in your governing documents, or unless otherwise stated in your governing documents. So you want to look out for those kind of key indicators. But generally, if there's a conflict between your governing documents and the law is going to prevail. When there's a conflict between your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, or your operating rules and the CC&Rs, your CC&Rs are going to prevail. When there's a conflict between the bylaws and the articles of incorporation, the articles of incorporation are going to prevail. And when there's a conflict conflict between your operating rules and policies, those are going to be superseded by any of those other governing documents. So now that we know the hierarchy, what is going to be the required elements of some of these documents? So for the CC&Rs, we're going to look to Civil Code 4250. And the required elements in your CC&Rs are going to be a legal description of the property, a statement that identifies the type of the development, the name of the association, and of course, since they're always really lengthy or usually very lengthy, it's going to include a lot of restrictions on the use or enjoyment in the development. And those are going to be equitable servitudes, which means that they run with the land and they're going to be binding on subsequent purchasers. Next slide, please. For the Articles of Incorporation, we're going to look to Civil Code 4280. So what's required for your Articles of Incorporation? They have to be filed with the Secretary of State for California. They have to identify the corporation as an association formed to manage a common interest development under the Davis-Stirling Act. They have to state the corporate office address, or if you don't have one, it's going to be the nearest cross streets of your association. And it's got to state the name and address of your managing agent, or sometimes people will use their agent of service process if that's different. For the condominium plan requirements, we're going to go to the next slide and look at Civil Code 4285. So if you are a condominium association and you have a condominium plan, this describes what has to be included in that for it to meet the standards. So you're going to need a description or survey map of the property, a three-dimensional map that shows in detail the common area and the separate interests, and a certification by the developer or subdivider. And the requirements of that certification, if there's any questions, which hopefully none of you have to deal with that, those are listed under Civil Code 4290. And then there's your operating rules. So those are governed by 4350, kind of tells us what those have to look like. So basically they have to be in writing. They have to be matters that are within the authority of the board, and within the authority that's either going to be governed by the law, so the Corporations Code, Civil Code, the CC&Rs, Articles of Incorporation, or your bylaws has to give the board the authority to enact those types of rules. They can't be in conflict with the law, CC&Rs, Articles of Incorporation, or bylaws, but as that first slide showed you, oftentimes that doesn't happen. So you're going to have to look at that hierarchy if they are in conflict, because the operating rules would be superseded by those other governing documents. And they have to be adopted in good faith and in substantial compliance with the requirements of the law. So what are the requirements? We're looking at 4360, which defines how you adopt operating rules. So the process requires that the board give general notice of a rule change at least 28 days before the rule change, and include the proposed text of the rule and the purpose and effect of the change. After that 28-day review and comment period, the board's going to hold an open meeting where you're going to allow further comment during that open forum. And then the board is going to vote on whether to adopt the rules in open session. And then if you adopt those rules, the notice of the changes has to be given given no more than 15 days after you adopt it. And then obviously under 4350, the operating rules have to be reasonable. So we're lucky, because I've seen some questions about this come up in the chat, that this chapter also gives us information about how to amend our CC&Rs. And that's covered by Civil Code Section 4270. So essentially that Civil Code section says that you're going to have to follow the requirements in your governing documents. So you're going to look to your CC&Rs. This also works for your bylaws, although that's not dictated by the Civil Code section, is you're going to look to those governing documents to see what the approval percentage is of members. You're also going to be looking at the quorum, because that's kind of your base step before you can even count those ballots for amending or restating your documents. So you're going to be looking for the percentage that's required to approve. You're going to want to look if there's any lender approval that's required, if you change specific provisions, or if you restate or amend generally. And there could be other approvals required. Sometimes there's city approval, county approval. I've seen some very unique and bizarre approval requirements. So you're going to want to make sure that whoever's helping you through that process is paying attention to those little idiosyncratic approval requirements. And if there's no percentage that's specified in the documents for approval, the default under Civil Code 4270 is going to be a majority of all of your members. And I think this is going to be touched on later, but I wanted to remind you that when you're amending your CC&Rs, this is going to be one of those secret ballot elections. So you're going to have to go through that process of sending out the secret ballots and getting that approval by your members in order to make these amendments to your CC&Rs or bylaws. And then under 4270, if your CC&Rs pass through this vote, you're going to have them certified. So they're going to have to be signed and witnessed by a notary by either the president. Sometimes your governing documents will list other officers that have to be involved in that signing and certification process. So again, look out for that within your own documents. And then the amendment has to be recorded, or restatement has to be recorded in the county or counties that the association is within. So that's only for the CC&Rs, the recording, but it's a good tip. We also want to look at a couple of other civil code sections. So Civil Code section 4225 allows the board without member approval to amend a portion of the CC&Rs with restrictive covenants that violate Government Code 12955. And that Government Code section prohibits housing discrimination. So if there are discriminatory provisions in some, usually we find them in older CC&Rs, but you never know. This Civil Code section allows the board to strike out those provisions without member approval. Civil Code section 4230 addresses the deletion of declarant provisions. Usually I see associations trying to do a full restatement at that point, but if you're looking just to delete those declarant provisions, Civil Code 4230 is going to be your go-to. And then 4235 allows for the correction of outdated references to the Civil Code by a board resolution without member approval. So for example, if you have CC&Rs that predate changes to the Davis-Stirling Act, this allows the board to go in and kind of clean up those references so that they reference the correct Civil Code sections. And then there's always outliers. So our new rental restrictions law that came through gave boards the authority to make changes to the CC&Rs without member approval. Basically, you treated it like an operating rule if you were making a change strictly to comply with those legal requirements. For example, changing your 20% cap on rentals to a 25% cap. And then there's also kind of hopefully your nuclear option, which is covered under Civil Code 4275, which is on the next slide. And that kind of kicks into place when you need judicial intervention to amend or restate those CC&Rs. So if the CC&Rs require more than 50% of the members to amend the CC&Rs, you can, and you're not able to get that percentage, you can petition the Superior Court to lower the approval percentage. Some things that you want to keep in mind, there's a number of things that you have to include in that petition in that Civil Code section, but the court is going to be looking for you to show the efforts that you made to gain approval. How many times did you send it out for balloting? Did you hold a town hall? If you held a town hall and there were member comments, did you make changes based on those member comments and then send it out for balloting again? Have you had problems reaching quorum in the past? Anything that you can do to show the efforts you've made is going to be helpful in that petition.
So at this point, ownership and transfer of interest, chapter number 4, we'll go to Lance Stewart of Angus and Terry. Lance, take it away.
Thanks so much, David. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. As you said, I'm Lance Stewart with Angus and Terry in Walnut Creek, and thanks for attending this morning. Chapter 4, ownership and transfer of interests. Building on some things you've heard about from Bill and Mark and Megan earlier, the simplest way I can think of to summarize what's going on in this chapter is that it's talking about what it means that homeowners have property interests in the common area and what happens when homeowners sell their individual property. So let's go ahead and go to the first slide here. We're going to get into Article 1. Article 1 starts out by giving us some basic ideas that you've heard some discussion of already. Number one being that homeowners, if there's common area in the development, homeowners have an undivided equal share in that common area. They hold it as tenants in common, one share per home. You've heard some reference to the idea of exclusive use common area. We'll come back to that in a moment. But for purposes of the general common area, the idea is that there isn't a patch of ground I can walk over to and say that's mine and yours is next to it. We all own the entire thing together. And as part of that, we have non-exclusive rights or easements for passage around the common area. We can pass through it to get to our home, we can pass through it to get to our car, and so on, as long as we're not interfering with other people's ability to use that common area. That's what we mean by non-exclusive rights. Article 1 also talks about the idea of peaceful assembly. This is a law that the legislature passed a couple of years ago. That's very similar to what we think of as the First Amendment to the Constitution, right to peacefully assemble. The HOA cannot, through its governing documents, prevent members from peacefully assembling or freely communicating regarding matters of social interest, matters of politics, matters of public interest, whether they're directly related to the HOA or not. So that means, for example, members can have a rally in the common area or a town hall meeting in the common area, have candidates for public office come out to the clubhouse and meet with folks. They can canvass or petition other members or distribute information. And the HOA can't charge fees or deposit for members making that particular use of the common area or require them to insure the common area for that use. Now, if somebody's holding an all-night party with lots of alcohol and other things going on, that you absolutely can charge for, but not for this. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to talk about transfer disclosure. This is something that can be a little confusing to boards, and that is when a homeowner is selling their property in the HOA, what is the HOA's disclosure obligations? And here's what it is. If I'm a homeowner in an HOA trying to sell my property, I have the disclosure obligations. I'm the one responsible for making sure the appropriate information is given to my prospective purchaser and the lender and so on. As part of that, I'm obligated to gather 10 different types of HOA documents, including the governing documents, the most recent annual budget and policy statement, information regarding assessments, whether I'm in violation of the governing documents, and so on. The HOA's responsibility is when I request those documents, the HOA must turn those documents over within 10 calendar days. That is the HOA's primary role when it comes to disclosure issues. Now, the HOA can charge the actual cost of having to gather and assemble those documents. If you're going to do that, this is something that's often handled by your professional management company through their escrow department. But if you're going to do that, you have to provide a specific form that's actually charted out in the statute that says, here's the estimate for what it's going to cost to get you these documents. And then when you provide the documents, you have to use that same form again. Here's the actual cost. In this day and age, as a practical matter, when so many things are retained electronically, homeowners can ask to receive them electronically. And the reality is that you're probably not going to be able to recover cost for that type of transfer, for that type of production. Article 3 gets into, sorry, let me just back up for a second. Article 2 also talks about the homeowner's obligation to disclose blanket encumbrances. It also talks about the penalties for violating these disclosure obligations. But an important point is that if there is some screw up in disclosing those HOA documents, that does not affect the validity of the transfer of title. Okay, let's go back to Article 3. Article 3 is meant to address something that I think used to be more common practice. That is, the HOA can't impose assessments, penalties, fees, just for the fact of a homeowner transferring title to their property. The HOA can recover the actual cost of updating its records to reflect the change in ownership and the cost of producing documents that we talked about a moment ago. There are some other exceptions if there are community service organizations or nonprofits that are providing particular services to the HOA, but those are pretty rare exceptions. Generally, the HOA can't charge fees just for the fact of somebody selling their property. Okay, moving on to Article 4. You've heard some discussion already today about the exclusive use of common area. And I think we're all familiar with this idea. More often than not, if you are a homeowner in an HOA, you have some portion of the common area that is assigned just to you. Only you get to use that portion. And we're talking about, parking spaces, garages, decks, balconies, things along those lines that come with the governing documents and come with your grant deed. What this law tells us is that, what Article 4 tells us is that if the HOA wants to create a new designation of exclusive use of the common area, in other words, take part of the common area that belongs to everyone and give it to just one person, that can only be done through a membership vote. You heard reference, I believe, from Megan earlier, and you'll hear more about it later regarding the process for that vote. It's got to be by secret written ballot and double envelopes, but it's got to be approved by fully 2/3 of the members. 67% of the membership have to agree, we're going to take part of the common area from everyone and give it to this one individual. And the resolution the members are voting on has to specify, is the HOA going to get compensated for that? And who's going to take responsibility for ensuring this new exclusive use of the common area? That's the default position, that you can't give new exclusive use to the common area without a membership vote. However, there are significant exceptions to that. We'll circle back around a little bit to the idea of some fair housing concerns, but a big one is disability accommodations. As a matter of both federal and state law, if somebody has a disability and needs an exception to HOA policy or needs to be able to modify their property, the HOA generally has to give that to that person, and that includes exclusive use of the common area where appropriate. This part of the law also creates exceptions for parking that the CC&Rs envisioned would be assigned but wasn't assigned. Electric vehicle charging stations in the member's garage or parking space, putting a solar energy system on the common area roof. We'll circle back to those topics in a little bit with Chapter 5. There are also exceptions for making sure we're in compliance with the law or public agency. There's other exceptions as well, but those are some of the most critical ones. All right, moving on to the next slide. We're going to talk about mechanics liens. I think we're all sort of generally familiar with the idea, you pay a contractor to do work to your property. If you fail to pay the contractor, they can place a lien against your property. The question that emerges here is, if that work to my unit had arguably benefited my neighbor's unit, and I fail to pay the contractor, can they then place a lien against my neighbor's unit? And the default position is no, you can't do that. However, if that neighbor expressly consented to the work being done, then they can. And in the instance of emergency repairs, then there's an assumption that that neighbor is deemed to have consented to that work. So they are susceptible to mechanics liens. The big issue for HOAs in general, though, is if the HOA performs work to the common area, hires a contractor to do that work, and then fails to pay that contractor or gets into a contractual dispute about whether money is owed, that contractor could place a mechanics lien against every single home in the development, which of course is a big problem for everyone. If that happens, the HOA has to provide notice to all the members that it's happening, and there's some specific tools that the individual homeowners can use to get their property out of Dutch, but you really want to stay as far away from that scenario as you possibly can. Finally, Article 5 circles back around to something that we talked about in the beginning of this chapter, and that is the idea that all homeowners hold an undivided equal interest in the common area. Whether you're talking about a community apartment, condo, planned development, stock cooperative, when that property gets sold, when a homeowner sells their property, if they have an interest in the common area, that's going to go with their sale of their property, as does their membership in the HOA. All those property interests stay together when the homeowner sells their home. All right, so that is Chapter 4 regarding ownership and transfer of interests. We're going to move on now to Chapter 5 regarding property use and maintenance. And this chapter gets into the HOA's ability to regulate what homeowners can do with their property, and who's generally responsible for maintaining what. We're going to move into Article 1 regarding protected uses. Protected uses here means the idea that the HOA has to permit homeowners to do certain things, that the law wants to require that the HOA allow or to protect homeowners' ability to do these things. I think what I have here is a little overly simplistic. It's not just a matter of policies the legislature wants to encourage. In some instances, we're talking about civil liberties as well. But these are all things that the HOA has to permit homeowners to do. And this part of the law, you've heard reference to this idea earlier. I think it was, Mark that was talking about it. This ties into a lot of other areas of law. We talk about parts of the civil code that aren't in the Davis-Stirling Act. This refers to different aspects of the government code, aspects of the health and safety code as well. These are areas of the law where what the HOA can and can't do is not just strictly constrained, it's very specifically constrained, the ways in which the HOA can regulate these issues. And there's a host of different issues that are covered in this article. We're talking about homeowners' display of the United States flag, display of religious items, display of non-commercial signs, whether they can have pets, whether they can install video or television antenna, installing roofs in very high fire severity zones, their ability to market their interest, using drought-resistant landscaping, pressure washing the exterior, whether they can rent their units, whether they can install electric vehicle charging stations and electric vehicle dedicated time of use meters, solar energy systems, floor area ratio standards, backyard agriculture, accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units, and clotheslines and drying racks. I think that last one is my favorite. We can't get into the nitty-gritty of all of those issues, but there is sort of a through pattern here that I think is helpful in thinking about how the HOA can regulate these things. So moving on to the next slide, that through pattern is essentially this. For all these things, dear HOA, you have to let homeowners do those things. However, the HOA can usually impose reasonable restrictions. And the idea of what constitutes reasonable in a given instance is where things get very technical in a hurry. For example, when you're talking about solar, there's a lot of very specific requirements about what the HOA can and can't do here. It also points back to aspects of the other aspects of the civil code. So there's some very technical pieces to how the HOA can regulate these things. But the idea of a reasonable restriction usually includes, or often includes, that the HOA can't, through its restriction, make the homeowner's cost significantly increase. You can't impose a restriction that has the effect of making somebody installing a solar system prohibitively expensive. Another recurring theme is that when it's applicable, the HOA can't impose a restriction that has the effect of decreasing the efficiency of that system. So you can't, in the same sense, impose a restriction that says, dear homeowner, you can install your solar energy system, but we're going to put restrictions on it where it effectively doesn't work for you, okay? If the HOA doesn't specifically navigate its ability to regulate these things in the way that the law prescribes, the HOA could be exposed to actual damages and civil penalties. We've talked about the interaction with other areas of the law, but the bottom line for these things is that the default position is the HOA has to allow these things to happen. If you don't have a policy that clearly articulates and navigates, and threads the needle in the way that the law allows the HOA to regulate these things, you're probably not going to be able to regulate them. You really need to have a policy in place if these issues are important to your HOA. And this is something where you really need to work with counsel on drafting that policy. Okay, moving on to the next slide. There are some more topics that we get into with Article 1, including a hot commodity over the last couple of years. You heard reference to this earlier. I think it was Megan was talking about it. And that is the idea of rental restrictions. The legislature changed fairly significantly HOA's ability to regulate rentals in the past couple of years, two different measures in 2021 and 2022. The overarching issue is that you can't effectively prohibit or unreasonably restrict homeowners' ability to rent their properties. As you heard Megan talk about earlier, you can't have a rental cap of less than 25%. You can prohibit short-term rentals of up to 30 days, but a critical point here is that all HOAs were required, if their governing document said something that contradicted these laws, all HOAs required to amend their governing documents by July 1st of this year. Initially, it was an earlier deadline. It got pushed out. If you haven't had a chance to deal with that with your counsel and see if there are provisions that need to be changed, please do so right away because you're now beyond that deadline. Accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units. Again, the legislature wants to encourage, we've got a housing crisis right now. The legislature generally wants to encourage the idea of building that in-law unit in the backyard or converting your garage to an apartment. This is another one where it's highly complex what the HOA can and can't do to regulate these things. You really want to have a policy in place to preserve those rights because the default position is that homeowners can do those things. And we've talked about the rest of these topics already. I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Okay. Article 2, modification of the separate interest. Much simpler idea, no less far-reaching. As a general matter, homeowners need to be able to modify their property, barring structural or mechanical issues. The HOA is permitted to govern how homeowners do that within reason and whether homeowners want to modify the common area. But you need to have an architectural review procedure in place. Now, most governing documents do have a procedure in place already, but this part of the code enshrines what that needs to look like. It needs to be fair, it needs to be reasonable, it needs to be expeditious, it needs to have specific limitations on how long the board can take on getting back to somebody's architectural proposal. Responses need to be in writing. They can't run afoul of fair housing law and so on. An issue that also pops up here, we've touched on this a little bit earlier, but the particular scenario where somebody says, a resident in my home has a disability, they can't access, the property the way they need to. I need to be able to modify that property. I need a wheelchair ramp. I need whatever to modify that property so that they have proper access. Here again, this is a very thorny area. You always want to have counsel involved, but you're going to err on the side of granting that accommodation request. Now, the homeowner is responsible for the cost involved, and the board does have the authority to look at the specifications and should look at the specifications to ensure compliance with the building code, the governing documents, whether it affects passage to other residents, and so on. But this is a hugely complicated area with tremendous repercussions if it's not handled properly. Absolutely work with counsel, and you're probably going to err on the side of granting it. All right, moving on to the next slide. Article 3, maintenance issues. Again, a fairly simple idea, but far-reaching implications. And I think this was touched on earlier by Mark. Who maintains what? In the simplest terms, under California law, the HOA maintains the common area and the homeowner maintains their property. And for exclusive use common area, we're going to split up the responsibilities between the HOA and the homeowner. However, as you've heard a couple times already, the governing documents can overrule that. This goes back to what was said at the beginning about, unless otherwise stated, if the governing documents say something different, they are the final word on who maintains what, not California law. This article also goes into what happens if the HOA is performing maintenance to the common area that requires residents to vacate their property. The homeowners are responsible for the relocation costs that come into play there, not the HOA. This also talks about if the HOA is going to use pesticide in the common area or around the homes. There's very specific notification requirements, a lot of detail that the HOA has to provide, particularly given potential health concerns. So you want to make sure you're complying with that part of the code if you're putting that pesticide in place. And finally, wood destroying pests. As a general matter, the HOA is going to be responsible for the common area, particularly when we're talking about condos. That's usually going to be an HOA issue. Termites don't magically appear from the outside world inside somebody's home. They're going to pass through the wall. They're going to come up through the ground. They're going to pass through the common area to get to that home. So that's usually going to be an HOA responsibility in condominium development. For planned developments, the homeowners are responsible for wood destroying pests in their own homes. However, the homeowners can, through the membership vote process that we talked about earlier, can decide to delegate that responsibility to the HOA and pay for it in the form of a special assessment. This article also talks about the HOA's ability to force relocation of residents when necessary for common area maintenance that needs to be performed. All right, that's all the scores and highlights that I have for Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. We're going to pass the baton now to the inimitable Amy Tinetti of Hughes, Gill, Cochran and Tinetti. Amy, take it away.
Thanks so much, Lance. I don't know if I can live up to that intro. So Chapter 6 is chock full of information. So in some ways, I lucked out getting this chapter. In other ways, this is going to be a huge challenge, and I just started a stopwatch. So although the entire Davis-Stirling Act was reorganized in 2014, I would say this is not at all scientific, but it seems to me that most of the substantive changes in the past decade have been about the things that are in this particular chapter. So there, if you've been on your board for a while, there may be some new information in here. So Connor, can you go ahead and skip that one, and we'll just start with Article 2 here. So you've got a whole summary that I prepared as best I could. I try to drill this stuff down. There's no way we can go through everything, so I'm just going to hit the highlights. So Article 2 is what we talk about as the Open Meeting Act. So when you hear us refer to the Open Meeting Act, we're talking about Article 2, Chapter 6 of the Davis-Stirling Act. So it provides in section 4910 that the board can't take action on any item of business outside of a board meeting. That includes via a series of emails. The only exception to that is if there's an emergency. I think Jasmine in the chat defined what an emergency is under the Davis-Stirling Act. So that really needs to be a true emergency, and we're talking about life and limb, really. You'll know if it's an emergency because you'll have to make a decision right away. If it's not an emergency, your board meetings need to be noticed. So in section 4920 of the Davis-Stirling Act, we've got requirements for open meetings. That's at least 4 days notice of the time and place of the meeting. And then for executive session meetings, at least 2 days notice of the time and place of the meeting. Agendas are required for every meeting, and that's really important. And we'll go on to the next slide. So I think there's, if you notice, Article 2 is called board meetings. Sometimes there's some confusion about board meetings versus member meetings because members can attend board meetings. So board meetings, if they are open meetings, may be attended by any member. They can't attend executive session necessarily unless they're invited, but members can attend open board meetings. That doesn't make them a member meeting, it's still a board meeting. And my favorite part of the of this particular part of the Davis-Stirling Act is members do have the right to speak at association meetings and at board meetings, but a reasonable time limit shall be established by the board. These are business meetings, not bitch sessions. And the board does have the right, in fact, the law says shall establish time limits for people to speak at board meetings. 4930 of the Davis-Stirling Act addresses the importance of agendas. And the big deal is that the board can't discuss or take action on any item in a non-emergency meeting unless the item was on the agenda. So this requirement that the agenda be posted prior to a meeting is so people know what the board's going to be discussing, and the members can attend that meeting and hear what the board discusses and what the board decides. That's the whole point of an open meeting, and telling people in advance what's going to be discussed. So next slide, please. Thank you. So section 4935 of the Davis-Stirling Act addresses executive session. So executive sessions are board meetings that are generally closed to the members of the association because they're designed to discuss confidential or privileged information. So you've got the list there of what can be discussed in executive session. Note that it says may, the statute says may adjourn to or meet solely in executive session to discuss these things. I would recommend to my clients that they discuss these things in executive session. So I would love if that said shall, but it does not. And then the board shall adjourn to or meet solely in executive session to discuss these other things: member discipline, if requested by the members, a payment plan for payment of delinquent assessments, and whether to foreclose on a lien. But executive session is not, we're uncomfortable discussing this in open session. It has to be one of these particular subject matter areas. Next slide, please. So section 4950 addresses minutes and when they must be made available to the members. So minutes, by the way, we're going to talk about records and records of the association in a bit, but minutes are supposed to be available from the beginning of time for your association, and a member can request minutes from the inception of the association. Now, I don't think I've ever represented an association that could actually produce those minutes, but that is what the law says. So I think there's some confusion about whether minutes have to be posted online or elsewhere or provided to the members. The law doesn't say that they have to be provided. They just have to be made available within 30 days. And they actually don't even have to be the final minutes. They can be draft minutes within 30 days of the meeting. It's perfectly fine for an association to provide minutes or post minutes, but it's not a legal requirement. And then 4955, I just want to raise that this particular chapter of the Davis-Stirling Act is chock full of these $500 civil penalty provisions. So this is one of them. So enforcement within 1 year of the cause of action, when the cause of action accrues, and a prevailing member may be entitled to attorney's fees and costs and a civil penalty of up to $500 for violations of the Open Meeting Act. And as is pretty common in the Davis-Stirling Act, the same is not true for the association. So the association can only recover its costs if the court finds that the action is frivolous, unreasonable, or without foundation. Next slide, please. So what we just went through was board meetings. Article 3 addresses member meetings. There's not as much in the Davis-Stirling Act about member meetings as there is about board meetings, but there is some stuff in the Corporations Code about member meetings. So Section 5000 says that parliamentary procedure is required, does not have to be Robert's Rules of Order, can be any parliamentary procedure that the board decides to employ. And again, members do have the right to speak and address the board at member meetings, but again, the board shall establish time limits for members to speak. Next slide. All right, this is where probably most of the changes we've seen in the past decade plus have been relate to member elections. So there's already been some discussion on certain votes of the members that require secret ballots. Megan mentioned the amendment of governing documents. Lance mentioned the grant of exclusive use of common area. So it's these things that are listed, and you'll note the last bullet is anything else identified in the operating or election rules. So back in the day, 2006 or so, when the first elections law went into effect that required election rules, some attorneys were saying any vote has to be by secret ballot. I don't see election rules that say that as much, but some election rules do say that any vote of the members has to be by secret ballot, but otherwise these are the ones required under the law. Next slide. This is new for 2022. So prior to 2022, some associations, especially in Northern California, were going along just fine doing election by acclamation, meaning the number of candidates was equal to or less than the number of seats available, in which case it didn't really make much sense to send out ballots when the results of the election were known. In 2022, we got all these requirements for election by acclamation, which I don't have time to go through. Just know that the nomination period is extended to at least 90 days, as opposed to a regular election where it would be 30 days, and there's some additional notice requirements that are involved. Next slide. So I mentioned that election rules have been required since 2006. They are not in your bylaws. They are a separate document. So the law provides that all associations have to adopt election rules. So your bylaws will say something about elections, but that doesn't make them election rules. They are supposed to be a separate document. We can go to the next slide. So Section 5115 addresses ballots and what the requirements for ballots and the timelines for sending ballots for these secret ballot votes. So again, there's a lot of stuff on this slide. I'll just say for the election and recall of directors, we're talking about at least a 60-day window, longer if election by acclamation is involved, because you have that additional time for the nomination period. And as Lance mentioned, these are secret ballots, dual envelope, and many requirements under the law for how that has to be handled. And next slide, please. So again, lots on this slide. All I'm going to say is the secret ballots have to be opened at a noticed meeting. So they don't get opened in advance. The law provides that members have the right to witness the tabulation of the ballots. So that occurs at an open notice meeting of either the board or the members. Next slide. So this is another, I'm just going to jump down to section 5145 about enforcement and challenge. Elections can be challenged within 1 year of the election. And this is another section you'll notice where there's a $500 civil penalty that may apply if someone challenges and the member prevails on that challenge. Records inspection is the next area. So there's a long list of items of records, I should say, that are available to members for inspection and copying. I have not listed them here. They're just different categories. And I will just note that the membership list as of recently now includes emails, which it previously did not. So there are specific timeframes. If you look at the bottom of the slide, specific timeframes for complying. Current fiscal year is within 10 business days following receipt of the request, and the previous 2 fiscal years is within 30 calendar days following receipt of the request. Next slide, please. The only thing I want to point out, again, I said this chapter was chock full of these $500 civil penalties. So there's a potential $500 civil penalty under section 5235 for violations of these record inspection laws. So that's another area. I think I counted 4 total, and 3 of those $500 civil penalty provisions are in this particular chapter of the Davis-Stirling Act. That is all I intend to go through. There is, oh no, there was one more, sorry. Can you jump to conflict of interest, please, Connor? The only thing I wanted to point out here is this is relatively new. We didn't have this statute until 2014 when the Davis-Stirling Act was reorganized. I just want to note that this section does not say that a director has to recuse themselves. It says that they can't vote on these particular items. So the question of conflict of interest, yes, we've gotten a little bit of guidance, but it's still a pretty fuzzy area. So if you have questions about conflicts of interest, I would encourage you to consult with counsel about them because they are pretty complicated. And I believe that is it. And Tom Fear is up for chapter 7.
Okay. This particular section doesn't have as much detail as the previous one. So I won't be speaking as fast as they have. Why don't we go into the next slide? Okay, so the main thing to remember about all this financial stuff is that, you know, collecting assessments is the lifeblood of an association. If you don't have money, you can't spend it, which is, you know, that's a whole nother topic on special assessments. But there's all these financial stuffs. I'm, you know, hey, I'm an attorney. I'm not a financial person. It drives me nuts to look over budgets and everything. But if you're on the board, I have seen situations where board members are just not aware of the finances of the association, and you can get in trouble. There have been instances where, you know, associations find themselves in a situation where someone, property manager, something, there have been bills going paid that they don't know what they're about. There's money going missing. Members get upset. They start suing everybody, including sometimes board members, for failing to know what's going on. So you've got all these rules. I'm going to go through them. It's not the most thrilling thing in the world for me. It may be for you, but for me, it's not the best thing. However, what I'm going to detail here is on a monthly basis. Everything I say is on a monthly basis. You've got to reconcile the association's operating and reserve accounts. I know this is basic, but associations have two accounts: their operating account, which is for day-to-day stuff, reserve account, where you're setting aside money for future expenses, painting, replacing a fence, putting on a new roof. Okay, that's reserves. So on a monthly basis, you have to compare operating revenues and expenses with the current budget. By the way, this is usually done by the property manager in kind of a spreadsheet. And the other thing you have to do on a monthly basis, you got to look at the current year's operating expenses and revenues and compare it to the current year's budget. So you can see if you're off. You know, I've been in board meetings where the treasurer goes, that may be great and everything, but that's not budgeted. You know, we're over budget in this area. So be aware of your budget. Then on a monthly basis, you got to look at your latest statements that are provided by banks or other financial institutions like savings and loans, perhaps credit unions. And that's got to be, these are statements that usually come from your operating and reserve accounts. All right. The next, on a monthly basis, you have to look at your income and expense statement as compared to the operating budget for the reserve accounts and the operating account. Lastly, you got to look at your check register. Be aware if there's any missing check numbers. That'll give you a clue something may be going on. You know, why aren't they in chronological order? Okay. Look at your monthly general ledger. Look at any delinquent receivable reports. The reason why that's in there is that, you know, if your delinquencies are tending to rise, there's got to be a reason. And you got to keep on top of that, because assessment collection is vital to keeping your association running. All right, next slide. All right, all these requirements, how do you satisfy them? And by the way, I have seen a couple of lawsuits where members are suing boards for not, you know, they don't see in the minutes where it says that they have looked at all this stuff and they've reviewed it and they've noted that in the minutes. You know, personally, I think you could spend your time doing other stuff, but anyway, that's one of the requirements of the law, that there's usually a subcommittee of the board that's authorized to do this. It's usually the treasurer and another board member, but however it is, it's got to be noted in the minutes. Next slide. All right, transfers. This talks about the law anyway. Transfers between the reserve account to the operating. It's never the other way around. I mean, usually your operating is just, you know, like everybody's checkbook kind of goes from month to month. Reserve accounts usually going to have a lot more money in it. So the law kind of sets two different exceptions to it. One is if it has 50 or less separate interests. You know, if you're going to transfer less than 5,000 or 5% of your income in your annual budget, you're exempt from getting written board approval for these transfers. And then if it's over 51 separate interests, it's $10,000. Next slide. Okay. This tends to be a hot button with some associations and homeowners. Okay. So this Civil Code section 5510 deals with the use of reserve funds, how you can get money out. Okay. To withdraw money from a reserve account, 2 signatures are required. 2, not 1. 2 directors or 1 officer who's not a director, and then one director. So you got to have at least one director. It's never, and I've seen some associations where the property manager has authority to pay everything and withdraw money. Never a good idea. Balancing checks is a good idea. That's what this is all about. Okay. Now, theoretically, your reserve funds are not to be used for any other purpose than for repair or that repair of major components of litigation. Okay, next slide. Okay. This section of the Civil Code talks about temporary transfers. Okay, you can temporarily transfer money out of your reserves to meet short-term cash flow requirements. Okay, but it's got to be noted in the minutes, and you got to have notice given to the members that this transfer is going to happen. You got to state the reasons for the transfer. You know, why are we doing it? And then how is the money going to be repaid? Okay, the law says you take money out of the reserves, it's got to be repaid within a year. All right. However, if there's going to be a delay in getting the money back, it's got to be noted in the minutes, and you got to tell people why is there a delay. Now, the other thing is you need to tell people if there's going to be a special assessment to pay back this money. And that's a whole nother topic that we won't go into today. But oftentimes, if money is borrowed from reserves, a special assessment usually is necessary to repay it. Okay, next slide. Okay. When funds are transferred from reserves to pay for litigation, notice has got to be given. All right. And this is another one that's almost never done. The law says that at least quarterly, there must be an accounting made of all expenses related to the litigation. That's an important thing to do because sometimes it's not, you don't keep track of what your expenses are. And the board needs to keep on top of that. And that's available for inspection by members. Now, in your accounting, you don't want to somehow attach that or give to the member bills, necessarily bills that go along with the litigation, like what experts are doing, what the attorney bills are. They may reflect some strategy that you don't want members to get a hold of, particularly if one of the members is suing the association.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you're learning a lot and enjoying the afternoon or the morning sessions. We're now going into our third plenary or breakout general session. If you could please mute your mic and turn off your cameras, we will start the third general session with Chapter 8 presented by Rehani Daldi. I think we've already done this one. Maybe I'm one. Yeah, no, I'm not. Okay, Rehani, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, David.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So at this point, I'll start off by guiding you through some of the different types of assessments and explain a few things that make them unique. So let's start off with regular assessments. Regular assessments cover the costs for your association's normal operations, as well as the reserves for long-term repairs and replacement for common area improvement. They're generally determined by the board during the annual budgeting process. And depending on the amount of the assessment, they can be increased by either the board or the members. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now on the next slide, we'll discuss special assessments. Special assessments are necessary for paying unexpected expenses that are not covered by reserves, as well as capital improvements. And similar to regular assessments, special assessments can be approved by either the board or the members, again, depending on the amount of the assessment. Next up, emergency assessment. So the board can pass emergency assessment if there is an emergency situation. Everyone asks, what constitutes an emergency situation? Well, there are 3 very narrow exceptions under the Davis-Stirling Act. So the first is a court order. So if the emergency expense is required by court order, that's an emergency situation. If there is a threat to personal safety, that's the second narrow situation. Or if there's an unforeseen expense. Now, for the unforeseen expense portion, it's an expense that could not have been reasonably foreseen by the board when they prepared the budget. Now, these are 3 very narrow circumstances where you can levy an emergency assessment. So just noting here, it's very important that you work with your legal counsel to make sure that it's done the right way, because I'm sure we've all seen it done the wrong way before. All right, next up, reimbursement assessment. Okay, so these assessments are levied against individuals, the owners, to reimburse the association for repairs to the common area that are damaged by either the owner's guests, or sometimes the owner's tenant. The ability to charge reimbursement assessments is included in some but not all governing documents. So just a note to make sure that you check and see if it's actually in your CC&Rs and that the board is authorized to levy these types of assessments. Now, before the association can actually levy a reimbursement assessment, there is a very specific process that you have to adhere to. So you have to give written notice of a disciplinary hearing to the owner that you're wanting to assess. You have to hold a hearing with that owner. And at the end of the hearing, the board needs to make a determination. So now that we went over the different types of assessments, we then move on to collections in the next slide. So this comes in when the owner is not paying their assessments. In terms of collections, there's different steps in the collection process, which are generally outlined below, and we can breeze through them very quickly. But essentially, if an owner is delinquent in paying their assessments, the association can record a lien on the property. It's important to know that the decision to actually record the lien has to be approved by the board in an open meeting. So it's very transparent. Owners can ask for a payment plan or dispute the charges. And, if the owner continues to fail to pay, the association can later foreclose on the lien. So it's important to note that you can't actually foreclose until the delinquent assessments reach a certain amount, or if the assessments are more than 12 months delinquent. And also, in order to foreclose, the board has to vote to approve, but as opposed to approving an open meeting, it has to be approved in executive session. Next up is insurance and liability. And on the next slide, exactly. So we're just going to go over the different types of insurance. So insurance in general is critical to protecting associations. It limits director liability and it manages your risk. So it is very necessary because the Civil Code actually requires associations to carry insurance policies for general liability insurance, directors and officers liability insurance, and fidelity insurance. There are risks for not having insurance. So for example, members can be on the hook for losses to injured persons or property. And also, if you don't have insurance, directors would technically be breaching their fiduciary duties. So this is something that's required, and make sure to check that you have the amounts necessary, because if you want to ensure full immunity for your directors and owners, you have to make sure that you have the minimum amount of insurance based on the number of lots or units that you have in your development. So that is it for insurance. Next up, I am excited to introduce you to Jasmine Hale. Take it away, Jasmine.
Thanks, Rayani. Okay, so I'm going to cover in 10 minutes or less everything there is to know about disciplinary actions, dispute resolution, and lawsuits. So we're going to get through it. Okay, next slide. First up, discipline. So whether it's the reimbursement assessment that Rayani was talking about, or privilege suspensions, whatever the case may be, couple things to understand. First, the codes 5800 to 5805. So that's this part of the code. So civil code requires 10 days prior written notice to a homeowner, not the tenant, before the board calls them to a hearing to go over, imposition of discipline. But check your governing documents, because sometimes the gov docs require more. And the civil code is very clear. If it requires more, you got to give more notice. So next, the notice. Civil code says date, time, location, and sort of general description of the alleged violation. I want everybody to keep that in mind. If you have not yet had a hearing, it is not appropriate to tell someone you violated the governing documents because you haven't had that hearing and you haven't made that finding. So just know that it sounds semantic, but there's a reason why all the news says alleged, alleged, alleged. Our hearing notices need to say alleged as well. While the civil code says that's what you need to have, the reality is I recommend boards have the specific factual allegations. Why? Because it's one thing to say, maintenance violation. Well, what does that really mean? A lot of times it may be a nuisance violation. Just to say nuisance violation, what is that? I recommend that you cite the provisions in the governing documents that are alleged to be violated so that the board is clear on what is the basis of this hearing. And then also you should identify what are the potential disciplinary measures. I can't tell you how many times a hearing notice just says you may be subject to fines and then never specifies how much. A homeowner who wants to challenge that after the fact is going to say, I was never provided with proper due process of what they were really going to do to me. So, expand what you're including in your hearing notices. Now, how do we hold a hearing? There's not a right or wrong way. It's not like in the civil code that says thou shalt do X. I do recommend that the board have its evidence ready to rock and roll, like have a copy provided to the homeowner who attends. I do recommend if there's witnesses that you make sure the witnesses are there. I can't tell you how many times a security guard or a patrol person is the person who submitted the report, and yet they're not there to actually provide the testimony at a hearing. So, that's something appropriate. I do recommend that, the board interview witnesses separately. So this is not like a free-for-all melee. I don't recommend having attorneys present at hearings unless it's A, disclosed to the homeowner beforehand, and B, it's generally going to be for something serious, but hearings do not require attorneys. I definitely do not recommend boards go through a hearing with an opposing counsel and you don't have your own counsel present. Can you? Sure. Should you? Not so much. And then last but not least, you have to mail notice of the hearing results within 15 days of the hearing. It's appropriate to identify what are the specific outcomes. Tell them your findings. We found you violated X. We are imposing fine A, B, C, D, or privilege suspension or reimbursement assessment. So all of those are in the needs to do notice after the hearing. Next, we're going to go to meet and confers. This is the internal dispute resolution, or you'll sometimes hear it called IDR. This is Civil Code 5900 to 5920. So first of all, what is an internal dispute resolution? It is a statute, a framework, we'll say, not just a single statute, that is intended to provide an informal, no-cost approach for homeowners and associations to resolve disputes. Legally, if a homeowner asks for one, the association must accept the request. Means you're going to do this. If the association asks for it, the homeowner can blow you off. I know that sucks, but it is what it is. The association is supposed to designate one director. One, not the whole board. Can't tell you how many times boards are like, we're doing IDR. And I'm like, ooh, but it's not supposed to be all of you. Certainly if a homeowner agrees to it, that's fine. But legally, just one director. They can bring a friend. I'm being facetious, of course. There is an additional person on each side that is able to attend an IDR, whether it's attorney, manager, another board member, a different type of advisor. So the board gets to designate if they're going to have that additional person and who it's going to be. Homeowners do not get to dictate who is the director that attends the IDR. I've had that happen a few times lately. You're like, no, the board's picking their person. So now how do we conduct an IDR? There's no right or wrong way. Again, I'm on the like no right or wrong way path. I do recommend providing a suggested framework for how you're going to do this. It's especially helpful to do that beforehand if the owner is known to be challenging or difficult to work with. Boards don't have to sit there through a harangue or an abusive tirade from a homeowner. If that's what happens, you can simply say, look, like, we're not here to take this kind of conduct, and we're asking for you to please be reasonable and respectful to us. And if they're not going to do that, then say, look, we're unable to find a resolution for your dispute, and conclude the thing. The objective of an IDR, just so everybody understands it, is to find a path to resolve a dispute. So how do we conduct IDRs? Allow the homeowner to explain in a set framework in a set period of time. So it's not like a 2-hour, and then at band camp, it started with X. But get to the point of what is your dispute and what is it that you're looking for? Now, because it's only supposed to be a board member, maybe plus one, the association, if you're able to come up with some sort of framework on, well, all right, if you'll do this, I'll do this, and we can do these things, that would be satisfactory to me. You put it in writing, and then what happens after the IDR? That I'll do this and you'll do this, and this is satisfactory. It goes to the board of directors. Why does it do that? Because the board would need to ratify that in order for it to be a binding, written agreement that governs the parties moving forward. Well, where would the board talk about this? At an executive session. The agenda topic would say third-party contract. Why? Because if this thing gets approved, it is actually a binding legal agreement between the parties. So that's IDR. Next, we're going to go to ADR. We're like alphabet soup here. So what is ADR? Alternative Dispute Resolution. Now we're at Civil Code 5925 to 5965. We're almost at the end of the Davis-Stirling Act. So what is really ADR? Like, all right, well, it's a bunch of letters. It's typically mediation or arbitration. Basically, it's dispute resolution facilitated through a designated neutral third party. That neutral third party is often a retired judge, maybe it's a practicing attorney. It doesn't have to be, but those are commonly who conduct mediations and arbitrations. So when is ADR required? By law, before an owner or a homeowners association files a lawsuit or an enforcement action against the other, except in very limited instances, you have to offer to attend ADR, so that mediation or that arbitration, with the other party. So good rule of thumb is just assume before you go off to court, you at least have to offer this. What are the limited circumstances when ADR is not required? Small claims court. If you're going in for an injunction or like a restraining order, also not required then, or just declaratory relief. But most of the time you're going into ADR. So why does it matter? Well, why does it matter? Number one, if you fail to offer ADR, or if you fail to accept an offer, there can be pretty negative penalties down the line at the end of a lawsuit. The big negative penalty is the judge can use a party's refusal or failure to participate in this, we'll just say ADR process against them. So even if you were the prevailing party and normally you would be entitled to recover your legal fees, guess what happens? Not getting them possibly, because the statute intends for it to be used as like a real club that gets people into a dispute resolution forum so they can try and resolve disputes outside of the court setting. So a few do's and don'ts for ADR. First, do absolutely work with legal counsel. At this point, if you're at this stage of a game, it is not recommended that boards try to handle this internally. The type of agreement that you may be negotiating is, intended to be legal and binding. So there you go. If the full board attends a mediation, then you're going to need to post an agenda that it's technically qualifying as an executive session. I would post pending litigation as the topic. If less than the full board attends mediations, it's certainly acceptable, but before those designated directors get there, have the board at an executive session designate their settlement authority. Like, you want to send your representatives in with the legal authority to negotiate on your behalf. Don't forget to respond to a request for resolution in 30 days. Again, why? Those penalties that I just talked about. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a client that gets me there, oh, we got this request for resolution. We don't really know what it is. And I'm like, well, when was it received? And they're like, well, about like almost a month ago. And I'm like, gads, like, don't do that. So, you got to send a response in 30 days. And the response should be, yes, we're happy to accept. So there we go. Next, we're going to get to lawsuits. Banging through it as quick as I can. Okay, so this is Civil Code 5975 to 5986. So important considerations. First and foremost, these should really be treated as like options of last resort. I know that passions sometimes in a dispute can be like, we're ready to like file that lawsuit. We're ready to like go for broke. Let's do this. And you're like, because they cost a lot of money, they take a lot of time, and they can have really long-term impacts, whether they're good or bad. It's really incumbent on not just boards, but also on homeowners to do everything they can to try and resolve this, short of having to go to court. I understand every attorney on this thing has jobs because we get to the point where you can no longer do that. But I do want everyone to hear, really do try to, in good faith, resolve disputes before you get to the litigation. So also important, review your governing documents. There are a lot of docs, certainly not all of them, but that do impose membership approval or certain kinds of protocols before boards can go file affirmative lawsuits. So you want to make sure that you actually have the legal authority to do that step, and check your documents. And it's important to understand, by law, associations have standing to initiate lawsuits even on behalf of members, in certain instances. So that's outlined in the code, but I do want everybody to hear, like, yes, your homeowners association can file lawsuits, and that's okay. So who pays for legal fees? Depends. If the lawsuit is filed against an association, normally the association will tender the defense of that lawsuit to your association insurance policies. So in that case, much of the time, but certainly not all of the time, your insurance carrier will appoint defense counsel to represent the association. A lot of times they'll do it subject to something called reservation of rights. What reservation of rights means is they're withholding the, hey, we may down the line, not pay for certain things, et cetera, but along the way, they're footing the bill. If a lawsuit is filed by the association is footing the legal fees. Like, all right, well, where does the money come from? Like, well, it comes from your homeowners. It's part of your dues. So that's why it's important for boards that are looking to bring affirmative lawsuits to really evaluate their financial ability to pay for the cost of the lawsuit beforehand. At the end of a case, legally speaking, it's in the statute if it's not in your gov docs, but most of the time it's in both. The prevailing party is entitled to recover their reasonable attorney's fees and costs. How do we know someone's a prevailing party? Because it went all the way through the case, all the way to a verdict by a judge or a jury. And after the verdict is rendered, the judge will determine who's the prevailing party and how much legal fees they get. A lot of times attorney's fees will become the tail that wags the dog. So don't let that happen, because it should really be about resolving the substantive dispute between the parties. But just know that reasonable attorney's fees does not mean recover all of your attorney's fees. And sometimes that's a sad face for clients to realize that, and certainly homeowners too. When not to sue. And you haven't exhausted all of your non-legal options. So go back to the ADR slide, go back to the IDR slide. If you haven't gone through those steps, you're not ready to sue. When you can't pay for your legal fees, we generally do not accept fees paid in, breads, and I'm kidding, but the reality is that associations need to plan for the expense of, litigation if you're affirmatively bringing a claim. And if you don't have the reasonable means to pay for it, you really need to evaluate whether it's appropriate to bring it. And then certainly if you don't have the legal authority, I have sometimes clients will say, oh, well, we're fighting this nuisance. It's outside our community. And you say, well, let's look at your documents. Do you have the ability to fight things outside of your community? And a lot of times boards will not. So that's when not to sue. And now I'm going to take it over to Spencer and the absolutely capable hands in talking about construction defects.
Thank you very much, Jasmine, and thank you everybody on the panel. Great job. We're really going to get through all of the Davis-Stirling Act in one day. Very impressive, and a lot of dense material there. I got the easy part. This is construction defect. It's going to be short. I know everybody wants to get into the breakout sessions, but we've got to get through it because it is the final chapter. So construction defect litigation. Go ahead, Connor. You can move on to the next slide. Number one, in California, there's what's called the statute of repose. We hear the term statute of limitations. In terms of the 10-year statute, it's called a statute of repose, which means it's an absolute deadline to bring a claim for construction defects in the original construction of a common interest development community. And so that statute begins to run when the project is substantially completed. So once it's constructed originally, you have 10 years to bring a claim if you have defects related to that original construction, which could be oftentimes leaking windows, leaking decks, leaking roofs, those types of things, structural concerns, fire code violations, what have you. So before you can bring a claim for construction defects in California, you need to go through what's called the Calderon process. In addition, there is a tandem procedure under SB 800 or the Fix-It bill. So there are two pre-litigation dispute resolution procedures that do apply. The Calderon Act only applies if it's 20 or more units in the community, and SB 800 applies, to all communities, regardless of size. So you do have the dual procedures, but SB 800 is outside of Davis-Stirling Act, so we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Calderon Act. So what is this designed to do? Well, really what this is designed to do, the Calderon Act, it is to give the parties an opportunity to resolve the claim before you initiate a lawsuit or arbitration. Typically, now, more recently, CC&Rs have arbitration provisions in there that state that if you are going to pursue a construction defect claim against a developer or declarant, you have to go through binding arbitration, which means it will be handled completely outside of the court system. But that is, the process. So before you either go to binding arbitration or file a lawsuit in Superior Court, you have to go through the Calderon process to try and resolve the claim in advance. Otherwise, the party could, if you file a lawsuit without going through Calderon, they can move to have it dismissed or stayed until you comply with the procedure. The Calderon Act, once it is initiated, it will toll the statute of limitations and statute of repose that applies to the claim. What that means is if you're coming right up against the statute of repose and you're almost at your 10-year period and you say, oh no, we need to file a lawsuit, but we haven't done Calderon. If you initiate Calderon, it will stop the clock, meaning it freezes time essentially for the statute. And until you complete that process, which is generally it's a 180-day process, unless it's extended by mutual agreement of the parties, then you can go through that without worrying about the time running. If it doesn't resolve, you can file for arbitration or file a lawsuit. Okay, next slide here, Connor. Okay, so what is the process and procedure for Calderon? It generally, you're going to have what's called a dispute resolution facilitator or a special master appointed at the outset. That is oftentimes a retired judge, or it could be a seasoned attorney that has handled construction defect cases in the past. And that person will act sort of like a mediator, but really what they're doing is kind of moving the parties along through the Calderon process. And they are there as a resource in the event that there are disagreements and disputes. You can give that individual authority to make rulings sometimes and bind the parties, but typically it's more of a role of like a mediator where the parties have agreed, well, this individual is going to sort of guide the process and we're going to respect their decision making if we have any type of a disagreement. But they're really kind of keeping the process moving along. They can also be a mediator too, so they can actually step in and serve the role as a mediator through this process. During the Calderon process, you're going to have a document exchange. So important documents about the construction, the original plans, construction documents will be exchanged, and the homeowners association will exchange records related to maintenance and repairs that have been performed, homeowner complaints about various issues. All of the documents that are going to be important to evaluate as part of the construction deficiency claims will be exchanged in this process. There will also be multiple site inspections typically and destructive testing possibly performed by consultants that are retained by both sides in construction fields and in particular disciplines depending on the issues. And that will help the parties to really figure out what needs to be done, whether the developer or builder is going to offer repairs or more typically pay money through their insurance carriers to resolve the claim. One of the most critical aspects of the Calderon process, the most important thing that is done, is the parties exchange mediation privileged expert reports. They are mediation privileged so that no party feels like if they put something out there ahead of time before they've, because this process happens at the outset. So you may not have done a full workup yet while investigating all the claims, but you want your experts to be able to put their opinions out there without fear that later on it could be used against them in discovery or deposition if you do go into litigation. So the mediation privilege essentially attaches to reports and says, these reports are protected. They can't be discussed or commented upon at a later time if this case goes into litigation. And that allows for the free-flowing exchange of information, ideas, and opinions early on to try and resolve the claim. And in addition, you're going to participate in numerous joint expert meetings where the consultants for various parties get into a room or nowadays on a Zoom and go through the issues and try and close the gap in any areas of disagreement. And then ultimately you have a mediation where you try to resolve the claim, settle it. Next slide here. Okay, so if you do reach an agreement or a settlement, either in the Calderon process or later if you're in litigation or arbitration, the Civil Code, Davis-Stirling Act does require you to provide notice to the membership of the settlement. And in that notice, you have to provide a description of the defects that will be repaired and typically a timeline for reconstruction. So when is it going to occur and what's going to be repaired, and a status of any claimed defects which are not being corrected or repaired at that time. In the event that you need to prioritize repairs for some reason based on the settlement dollars that were achieved, and there are certain items that maybe aren't being addressed as a result of funding and or as a result of just being lower on the priority. Maybe there are technical violations that the board never has any desire to resolve. They'd rather put their money to different use. You do have to advise the membership of that. If the membership doesn't make the decisions, the board has discretion with respect to how the funds are used. Typically, unless the settlement agreement directs that the funds have to be used in a certain way, which is pretty uncommon, but it can happen. Next slide, Connor. So in addition, the code requires that prior to filing suit or initiating arbitration, and at least 30 days in advance of that, you've got to send out a notice to the membership. The notice will state that there's a meeting that's going to take place to discuss the problems that may lead to arbitration or litigation over construction defects, the financial impacts that will have on the association and its members, the options that are available to address the problems, and typically those include filing a lawsuit or arbitration when you're at this point. And obviously it's going to tell you the time and the place of the meeting. The only exception to a timeline for providing this notice is if the statute of limitations, the statute of repose, is about to expire and the board doesn't have the 30-day time period to provide notice and hold the meeting, then the association can go ahead, file the lawsuit, or initiate the arbitration to protect the statute, and soon thereafter as possible, they can provide notice and hold the meeting. So that's the Construction Defect Act.
I want to thank everyone for participating today. It's been an exciting and just packed full of information day. I think we've all learned quite a bit. So welcome back. Thank you for being a member of ECHO. If you're not a member of ECHO, please consider joining ECHO. You can join ECHO by going to our website online at www.echo-ca and clicking on the membership tab. We are going into our 50th anniversary as an association. We will be doing a number of fun things in 2023. We hope that you all will participate. For those of you who are interested in meeting in person, we have also started a regional resource panels. The next panel meeting will be the Wine Country panel on September 9th in Rohnert Park. The topic will be how reserve studies are formulated and how to help your reserve analyst help you. We also have planned a North Bay resource panel on September 14th in Novato, which will focus on weatherizing and getting ready for inclement weather by using a maintenance calendar. The one program on reserve study should be particularly important to some of the questions we had today about how to plan projects that aren't in the reserve study. We are excited to invite any HOA board members or former board members to join the ECHO HOA Board Members Club. This exclusive group meets every second Tuesday of the month from 5:30 to 7 p.m. and features a unique opportunity to learn from your peers. Please consider joining the club. We currently have 237 members sharing information and knowledge. If interested, please click on the sign-up sheet in the packet or email Patty Curzette at pcurzette@echo-ca. This has been a fun program and very interesting. Thank you to all of our presenting attorneys. You did a great job, covered a lot of information. Once again, thank you to all of our sponsors who made this broadcast possible for everyone to view. And of course, thank you, our participants, for participating in today's webinar. ECHO appreciates your investment in education to build better HOA communities.